Good morning, everyone. My name is Kim Kelly. I'm the Director of Legislative Affairs at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Welcome to this panel, which will address the importance of considering animals in political campaigns. As we've heard over the past couple of days, there are animals in dire situations throughout the world, and there are global efforts underway to address these issues. But one thing that we have not yet talked about in great detail are political campaigns, and that's one of the key ways to improving animals' welfare. Having elected officials in place, whether legislators, sheriffs, prosecutors, and others who value animals and are willing to champion their issues. Make no mistake, we are making progress. More and more, animal protection is increasingly talked about in the mainstream. Everyday individuals are having conversations about animal welfare issues. And elected officials are starting to include animal protection as part of their platforms and their campaigns for election and re-election, and constituents are holding them accountable. We're really proud to have recently launched a 501c4 organization, an affiliate, the Animal Legal Defense Legislative Fund, which I'm really proud to serve as the executive director. And it will allow us to provide endorsements and financial contributions to candidates who have a record of supporting animal welfare legislation and enforcing the laws. Here to tell us more about political and legislative campaigns, we have three wonderful presenters, as well as a special recorded message. After the presentation, we'll be taking questions from participants joining us both online and here today. And for those of you joining us virtually, you can submit your Q&A at the bottom of the page. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers, both the recorded video and our panelists. We have Assemblyman Dan Benson, who represents New Jersey's 14th District in the New Jersey Legislature. He has directly sponsored or strongly supported myriad animal protection bills throughout his career, spanning topics from humane law enforcement, puppy mills, circus animal cruelty, to marine animal welfare, and many other initiatives to make the state a better place for animals. Thanks to the leadership of Assemblyman Benson and the respect he garners on both sides of the aisle, New Jersey has been the first nation on significant animal protection legislation, such as Nosey's Law, a comprehensive ban on wild animals in traveling shows and circuses. He's been recognized by numerous animal protection organizations and advocates over the years as a champion for animals. In the current 2022-2023 legislative session, he is the prime sponsor in the Assembly on a bipartisan bill to ban cruel wildlife killing contests and has signed on to co-sponsor all the priority initiatives of the Animal Legal Defense Fund, including, but not limited to, Courtroom Animal Advocate Program bill and the Pre-Conviction Cost of Animal Care bill. We also have Solomon Malik, a Colorado native, who's been a professional contract lobbyist in the state of Colorado since 2005 and is the principal of Peak Government Affairs. He graduated with honors from Metro State University with a degree in political science, and his professional background includes working as an emergency medical technician and a wildland firefighter in Southwest Colorado. We've also had the pleasure of working with him for the past few years on groundbreaking farmed animal protection legislation. We have Jake Kamins, who since 2013 has served as the Animal Cruelty Deputy District Attorney in the state of Oregon, where he represents the state in criminal animal cruelty cases. To date, Jake has been sworn as a Deputy District Attorney in 21 of Oregon's 36 counties, prosecuting over 150 individual cases of animal abuse and neglect. As ACDDA, Jake trains and consults with law enforcement, veterinarians, animal rescue workers, and attorneys on animal cruelty issues. He also communicates regularly with the media as a subject matter expert and has been involved in legislative drafting and testimony. Jake worked as a deputy DA at the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office from 2009 to 2013. He received his BA in 2004 from Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, and his JD in 2009 from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland. I think a few of you are aware of that school. At Lewis and Clark, Jake was an associate editor of the Lewis and Clark Law Review and clerked at the Clackamas County District Attorney's Office. While at Multnomah County, Jake developed a passion for working on animal cruelty cases. In 2012, he is named one of the nation's top 10 animal defenders by the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Before I turn it over, I also just want to introduce Emma Hurst, who has recorded a message for us. She's a member of Parliament representing the Animal Justice Party and the upper house of New South Wales Parliament, Australia, since March 2019. Emma has fought tirelessly for the rights of animals for many years, fighting to outlaw puppy farming, improve animal protection legislation, and ending the use of battery cages. She and her team have changed many laws in New South Wales, ending the use of cetaceans for entertainment, increasing penalties for animal abuse, outlawing fetish crush videos, implementing mandatory animal bans for abusers, and outlawing convenience killing in pounds. Prior to being elected, Emma worked as a psychologist and ran campaigns at various animal protection charities. She also ran a rehoming service for research animals, rescuing hundreds of animals that have been used in experimentation. So we'll start with the video and then turn it over to our live speakers.
Hi, my name is Emma Hurst. I'm a member of Parliament. I'm a politician here in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, and I represent the Animal Justice Party. We are a political party that is focused on animal law and animal protection law. I thought I would run through some of the wins that my team has achieved since I was elected 3 years ago, just to give an idea of exactly what can be achieved when there's somebody representing animals in the political space. So we have ended the use of cetaceans in entertainment, so animals like dolphins and whales from being forced to perform circus-style tricks. We have managed to get 8-fold increases in penalties, and we've also doubled the jail time because we need to make sure that the crime of animal cruelty is taken very seriously in the courts. We've also introduced mandatory lifetime animal bans for abusers for those higher level offences. So they're automatically disqualified because we heard that a lot of, it was very difficult within these prosecution cases to convince courts to actually give lifetime animal bans. We've also changed our domestic violence laws. So we've included animals on apprehended domestic violence orders so that they can also be protected. We also got grant funding for refuges to be able to upgrade their facilities, to be able to house animals when people are actually fleeing violence, so they can actually take their animals and make sure that they are safe as well. And our legislation actually recognises the link between domestic violence and animal abuse. Similarly, recognising the link between human and animal violence, we've also changed our working with children's check system to make sure that higher level animal cruelty offences are automatic disqualifiers from being able to pass a working with children's check. And those lower level offences are trigger offences, alerting the children's guardian so that they can make a decision about whether or not that person should be allowed to work with children. We've also banned the possession, distribution and production of bestiality and animal crush videos. And yes, horrifyingly, that wasn't already illegal here in New South Wales, and we're the only state right across Australia that has actually banned crush videos, and we're the second state in Australia that has banned bestiality videos. We've also ended convenience killing in pounds. So this came after a horrific story of one council pound here actually shooting a mother dog and her newborn puppies, despite the fact that there was at least 2 rescue groups that were willing to go in and take those animals and find them loving forever homes. So we found that that was perfectly legal for those councils to do that. These convenience killing laws will mean that councils cannot block rescue groups from coming in and taking animals off death row. And it will make sure that councils have to take actions to attempt to rehome every single animal that comes into their care. We also got over $2 million to help eradicate wombat mange, which is a very serious disease here in Australia. It could potentially wipe out wombats, but the funding that we got will treat at least 10,000 wombats who are suffering from this disease. I've also recently just passed a piece of legislation in the upper house. We have to pass legislation in both houses. So we're halfway through getting our right to release bill passed. And the right to release bill will ensure that animals who have been used for medical experimentation are given the right to be released from medical experimentation so that they can also find loving homes. And that's just some of the things that we've changed. We have changed other laws as well. We've also run an enormous number of inquiries. We've done inquiries into the continued use of batcher cages in the egg industry, into puppy farming, into koalas, into kangaroos, who are both facing significant decline here in Australia. And we've also run inquiries on our entire act around the prevention of cruelty to animals, and also the enforcement of those laws, and whether or not charities are properly enabled to be able to enforce our animal protection laws. There's so much more to do, and obviously the Animal Justice Party is very focused on all of these areas. I really wish I could be there at the conference. I hope that I'll be able to come to one of these conferences in the future. I would love to meet you all, and thank you for everything that you are doing for animals.
Okay, perfect. Everyone hear me great. My name is Dan Benson again, and I serve in the New Jersey State Legislature, and I've served there for 12 years. But I actually got my start on local council in my hometown of Hamilton. It's a very large suburban town outside the state's capital of about 95,000 residents. And when I first ran for office, I was 25, running for council. For many years prior to that, I was going to my local council meetings. I was very much involved in community service organizations. And one of the things that I had noticed, and it drove me to run for office, was that when different groups of folks had grievances or issues or things that they wanted to be heard, when they came before the local council, they were often belittled, they were dismissed, and they were sent away. And rarely were things ever answered or questions. And folks just weren't being taken seriously. And they could do that because they were winning elections over and over and over again, no matter what happened. And so I worked to elect a new mayor in that town. It was the first time the party changed in 26 years in that town. And part of that was working on an issue related to our animal shelter at the time. New Jersey had rules that after you had an animal for a certain number of days, it could be euthanized. And the minute that time was up, 1 second later, that's exactly what they did. And a lot of residents in the town wanted to see it moved to a no-kill shelter. At a minimum, we wanted to see that as long as there was space, things should stay the way they were. And so we worked with a lot of animal welfare activists in the community, folks that were volunteering at the animal shelter, folks that were fostering, and later another group that came in to help us with TNR practices in the community. And so things like that really kind of drove when I ran for council. We didn't have any official endorsement processes. We didn't have any campaign literature that often mentioned these things. But we had a lot of kind of grassroots activism in the campaigns that did it. Kind of fast forward to when I became a legislator in 2011, my chief of staff that I chose, it was someone that I'd known from local politics for many years. She was serving as an assistant commissioner prior in the Department of Transportation, but she was a very well-known animal welfare activist in her own community and on a lot of kind of legislation. She had in the past been a lobbyist, and I know you'll hear more about kind of that world as well. But so when I chose her as my chief of staff, I knew that was going to be a part of my portfolio as a legislator. And so thankfully working with a lot of different groups in New Jersey, and particularly Brian Hackett, who's now with ALDF, we've been able to do so much. We're a very small, unofficial caucus of members in the legislature that take on these issues. And we've lost a few on the Senate side. And so it has been challenging. But one of the things that has helped a lot is that particularly, you know, oftentimes I would say in campaigns, you'd get the candidate wants to be taking a picture with the family pet, and that's in the campaign literature. And that's kind of like the far one side of it. We've included the bills that we've gotten done, and you heard Kim talk about that earlier, in our campaign literature. But I will tell you, kind of parallel with, say, the environmental community, there's a lot of kind of similarities in how campaigns are run or legislation is run. In New Jersey, there's about 4 or 5 different animal groups. Same thing on the environmental side. So what oftentimes there isn't a single voice that's speaking on different pieces of legislation. There's often a lot of competition for what the prime bill that the community is talking with. And that makes it very difficult sometimes for us to prioritize things to get done. However, those groups, some endorse, some don't. Sometimes some share lists, some volunteer on campaigns, some don't. And this is why, the announcement of the 501c4 is so important. Same thing was in the environmental community. There are 4 environmental groups in New Jersey. Some, like the Sierra Club, have been around for decades, very active, knowledgeable. One of the newest groups on the scene has a 501c4 and instantly oftentimes shoots to the head of credibility, because when candidates run, they can have that stamp of approval when they're running. They can say, not only am I endorsed by this group, but we know they're sending out mailers on our behalf. They're doing social media on our behalf. And so that ability to kind of embed themselves into a parallel campaign for someone's candidacy, when a candidate gets elected, that oftentimes has a huge impact. And that feeling of, well, they helped me get there. There's a sense of obligation on that kind of agenda. And so I've seen that a lot with the work that I've done, and to see how things advance a lot better with my colleagues. Whereas before they said, okay, this is a bill that we want to get passed, but it's really going to be a political liability. Okay, maybe the hunters are going to be opposed to it, or this group's going to be opposed to it. Instead, now it's going the other way around. We're starting to see legislation as a political benefit for candidates to run, but we're not there yet. And that's why having groups like that establish a 501c4 really helps, because then you can do candidate contrasts to say, okay, between these 2 candidates, this is a candidate that supports our legislation. This is one that didn't respond to a survey. We can make sure there's donations that go out to campaigns. And you'd be surprised, small amounts go a long way in support, and campaigns are very expensive in New Jersey. We are in 2 of the top, the number 1 and number 3 or 4 media markets, with New York and Pennsylvania there. We're always competing with campaign ads from the neighboring states at the same time. It's one of the reasons why we do elections in odd years. But all that kind of comes together in the kind of campaigning, but also in the policymaking side of it. And so I'm trying to work with more of my colleagues to see the positive benefits from a political standpoint of animal welfare legislation and animal rights legislation. One area that I think, and we can talk more about this, that I think we run up to a barrier, and I think where the C4 can help there too, is educating journalists. Once you get away from things that deal with cats and dogs, it almost immediately you get the reaction of, well, this is a joke piece of legislation, or this is not serious, whether it's the shark fin bill or kangaroo leather importation and other types of animal rights bills. It's often okay, this will be nice to do, but oh yeah, we're going to get laughed at for doing that in the press or from colleagues. And that's where leadership that decides which bills move oftentimes will shy away from these bills. And so it's important that we kind of work the refs, which are the media and the groups out there, to understand why these bills are important, why they matter, and why there's a constituency within a state to see these done. You do polling, and oftentimes we see you have a majority of the public with us on these issues, but it doesn't always filter down because of a very vocal minority that often comes out and speaks out against the legislation that we try to pass. So I'm going to stop there. I know there's going to be a lot of time for discussion, but the key to understand is if policy matters, politics matters, campaigns matter. We've seen campaigns make a difference. And so being a part in all aspects of that really is how we get legislation done and how we move the movement forward.
Hey everybody, Sol Malik. It's nice to be here. I am a lobbyist in Colorado, and it is a very active state when it comes to animal welfare. Basically, anything that happens in Colorado really does translate to other states. When it comes to politics, campaigns, policy, it really is pretty, it's all related, I think. We've come a long way in Colorado with gestation crates, with field crates, with the circus bill that we passed a couple of years ago. But there's a lot of work still to be done. We have cruelty exemptions for ag that we're looking at, mental health issues around animal welfare issues. So it's a dynamic time in Colorado, but it's also a really kind of exciting time. We have 100 legislators, 65 in the House, 35 in the Senate. Our session is 120 days long, and that's by constitution. So you can't really go past that, which for me is really nice because there's some predictability as to when we're going to end, and it doesn't just languish. Our governor, Polis, is pretty progressive. We're going through an election cycle right now. He will win, I think. I don't see any things pointing the other direction. And the first gentleman is a very vocal animal advocate. So we actually have a really good venue for animal welfare in Colorado. But like the Assemblyman was saying, it's the small voices that are sometimes the loudest and make it really difficult to get things done. So we, as a lobbyist, I took over my father's firm, and he always said, politics is chess with live mice. And trying to be linear as a lobbyist, it's just that it doesn't happen. We have to be fluid. On top of that, all we really have is credibility when working with elected officials. They have to know that the client I'm representing is genuine and credible. And I also have to have that relationship with them to make sure that they trust what I'm telling them is actually the truth. There are lobbyists out there that give lobbyists a bad name. It's just in any industry, that's how it works. But the majority of us are ethical, and we work really hard to help elected officials understand the issues. With a citizen legislature like Colorado, it's that they're not experts. They're not experts in animal welfare. They may be stay-at-home moms, stay-at-home dads, teachers, lawyers. So they depend on lobbyists like me and clients like ALDF to give them the real policy truth and to be able to go talk to their colleagues or other organizations, knowing that what we've told them is actually credible. So right now, we're just in general, Colorado has a very sympathetic ear to animal welfare. We're pretty progressive. We're about 29% Republican, 29% Democrat, and the rest are unaffiliated. So the unaffiliateds, I mean, you get to the unaffiliateds, you're going to win most elections. And that also means that we have a venue for the unaffiliateds. And we probably know where the Democrats are going to be, probably know where the Republicans are going to be, but it's really the unaffiliateds that we want to influence and talk to and educate, most importantly. Just because you pass legislation doesn't mean the state's going to enforce it. Which makes the legal community that much more important when it comes to litigation, when it comes to just court proceedings in general. But you can pass the best legislation in the world, but if the Department of Ag or Natural Resources or Parks and Wildlife doesn't want to enforce it, they're not going to. So we need that legal side of the argument. The other groups, like the Assemblyman was saying, we have about 4 or 5 as well, all the way from very big to very small. And we have to be really coordinated, because if we're not, and we're stepping all over each other, it makes our arguments a lot harder. And it's competitive. I think people want credit for good policy. That's just kind of how it is. So it makes it tough because of that competition sometimes. And I think just to kind of end my little piece here, representing animals is tough. they can't testify. They aren't able to tell their stories. So it depends on us to go out and actually tell those stories. And it's difficult because you don't have that dialogue that you do with any other industry. So, and lastly, talk to your legislators. They will remember you. I guarantee it. And when you talk to them, it gives them cover to go to their colleagues, to other groups and say, no, I'm hearing from my constituents that they want this change, or that they want to uphold this policy, that it is productive and helpful. So yeah, go get a cup of coffee, go get a beer. Just they're people just like you, and they will remember you. I promise you. So.
Good morning, everybody. As said, my name is Jake Kamins, and I work as the Animal Cruelty Deputy District Attorney throughout the state of Oregon. I want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. I am appointed I was counting up 11 counties currently prosecuting cases of neglect, abuse, animal abandonment, things of that nature. I'm also the campaign manager for my wife, who is currently sitting on the Oregon Court of Appeals. So the disclaimer is nothing I say today should be construed as the position of any of the DAs that have appointed me at any point, or Judge Jackie Kamins. So with that out of the way, this panel has a little bit of an actor's nightmare quality for me. I did theater in high school and college, and still to this day get those nightmares where I'm on stage and I don't know what I'm doing there. I haven't memorized my lines. I don't have the right costume on, but you got to go when the show must go on. Initially, I would point out that I am not a very political person, aside from my position as campaign manager. Politics is an avocation for me. I am very interested, having grown up in the DC area, particularly with how the sausage gets made. But as a prosecutor, it's really my job to uphold the laws and enforce those laws, and not so much write the laws and influence how the laws get made. So a little bit out of my depth here, but happy to step in. And the other thing is that I am a replacement for the original choice for this spot, which was Nicole Harris, who is a wonderful deputy district attorney here in Multnomah County, who has done animal cruelty cases for even longer than I have in the Multnomah County DA's office. So with those caveats in place, the way that my job works is that I am a contractor who works with the Benton County District Attorney's Office. In Oregon, criminal cases are largely prosecuted by district attorneys. There are 36 counties in Oregon. There are 36 county district attorneys, and they prosecute criminal cases on behalf of the state of Oregon. There are also some city prosecutors. And then there's, of course, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Oregon, which prosecutes cases on behalf of the United States. Every district attorney position in the state of Oregon is an elected district attorney position. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is the difference that might make in terms of how things get done, how priorities are chosen in a prosecutor's office. Versus in some situations, I know New Jersey is like this, where all the prosecutors are appointed, not elected. So they're not directly held responsible for their decisions by the elected, by the body of voters. Although it is a little bit fuzzy here in Oregon. So what you have is you have these district attorneys. If they resign or retire in the middle of their term, their replacement is appointed by the sitting governor, and then typically that person will run for re-election. So you have sort of a quasi-appointment election system. My job as a deputy district attorney is always appointed. I'm available throughout the state to prosecute cases on behalf of the state. So when I come in, I'm beholden to this elected official, and whatever he or she wants me to do, I have to follow their marching orders in that sense. There is a Department of Justice in Oregon that has statewide prosecutors. who can go in, they can prosecute cases with or without the consent of the local district attorney. That's kind of a different beast. And then also the attorney general is an elected official, so they're beholden to them. Prosecutors are a critically important part in how these laws are enforced. I think as they were saying, you can pass all the laws that you want, but if a prosecutor doesn't get off their duff and actually charge the cases, then you're not going to have those outcomes that you imagine when you're passing the laws. And prosecutors are very proud to have, pretty broad discretion in how they charge cases, in how they allocate their resources, and at the end of the day, in how they resolve those cases that they do prosecute. So for example, if you have a prosecutor come in who's very interested in criminal justice by way of reconciliation and making sure that people are educated and deal with their mental health, that's going to be a very different situation for the people who are prosecuted than if you have a prosecutor who is all about retribution and putting somebody in jail or prison. I tend toward the first way, particularly because here in Oregon, the reality is that even the worst animal cruelty offender, either in 5 years or 15 years, depending on how bad the offense was, they're going to be free and clear of the legal system. They're going to have no restrictions on them in terms of their ability to own animals, to start businesses with animals, any of that stuff. So I have to keep that in mind when I'm prosecuting, the reality is that because of the laws that we've chosen to pass, they are going to have the ability to own animals again. The other thing that hits the animal cruelty world is that we don't have any kind of enforcement mechanisms similar to what they have in a sex offender situation, similar to what they have when people can get life probation, things of that nature. So you have to understand that even if a person is convicted here in Oregon of animal cruelty, they go up to Vancouver, Washington, and they can start the cycle all over again. There's nothing about Washington's laws that's going to prohibit them at all. So when you're dealing with the political question, I think it is critically important to get the prosecutors on board, to get that voice in the room. I think people would be surprised, these prosecutors' races have become real flashpoints for a lot of the political issues of the day. People talking about defunding police, people talking about, rolling back prosecutors' jobs, replacing that kind of with a different sort of mechanism. But something that I think people don't necessarily take into account is there are going to be these offenses with these victims who can't stand up for themselves. They can't advocate for themselves, whatsoever. And when you lower the ability of prosecutors to do their jobs vis-a-vis crime, generally speaking, you're going to hurt their ability to prosecute animal cruelty crimes as well. There are a bunch of different ways that Oregon has, in the past decade or so, increased the severity of punishments on animal cruelty cases. One is obviously having my position around makes it easier for prosecutors to hand me their cases and continue on prosecuting as they see fit. I don't ever charge for my services. I come in, prosecute the case, and take that large scale case, complicated case, technical case off the desk of a line prosecutor who's otherwise doing, the robberies and murders and things of that nature. Additionally, in 2013, we passed a huge bill called Senate Bill 6, which increased the penalty for animal abuse, created felony level offenses for animal neglect, created regulations for what are called animal rescue entities, that those regulations are still being sort of hammered out at this time, and really tightened up the enforcement mechanisms. There's still a ways to go. I got to tell you honestly, animal cruelty crimes, even here in Oregon, which is one of the highest ranked states for this kind of thing, cap out at level C felonies. There's no mandatory minimums for animal cruelty offenses. As I mentioned, the most that you can prevent somebody from having an animal going forward after the worst conviction you can think of is 15 years. So we have a lot of things that we could fix. You know, some of the statutory language is not as clear as you'd want it to be. There's no statutory right to or statutory option to do a diversion or deferred sentencing. That's a tool that a lot of prosecutors will use to try to get that education piece in place, to try to get that mental health piece in place. You have somebody who comes in who's abused or neglected an animal, and they are remorseful and they understand what they did was wrong and they want to make it right. They want to pay the restitution. They want to understand where they went wrong. You know, you don't necessarily have to give that person the punishment of a conviction, jail, probation, and the loss of the ability to own animals. You can work with them on educating themselves and on mental health pieces, and try to keep them, you know, a productive member of society. You know, the last thing that I want to talk about is in Oregon, when that package of bills was passed in 2013, one of the things that the legislature did at the same time, which is just a great tool for prosecutors and for anybody arguing the point of animal cruelty, is that they put legislative findings right into the law. You know, they basically put their thinking about why they're increasing the penalties, why they're moving in this direction right into the law. And the first thing that it says in Oregon's animal cruelty statutes is animals are sentient beings capable of pain, fear, and suffering, and should be cared for in ways that minimize pain, fear, and suffering. And I haven't had a jury trial that I've had since then where I haven't impressed that upon the jury. And that's a good argument also for judges that are deciding pretrial issues. It's a good thing to say to the media when they're asking about, well, isn't this development one step too far for animals? And it's like, no. Well, actually, here's the thing. Animals are sentient beings capable of pain, fear, and suffering. And so you want to reduce that because we live in a just and equitable and fair world. So that's all I had for notes. I'm happy to answer any questions, but thank you for the opportunity to come out here.
And we have a couple different microphones if folks would like to join.
Thank you. That was a great panel. I guess I have a question about consequences. So I'm from the great Northeast, and in the state of Pennsylvania right now, there's an ad being run about one of the candidates. I won't mention his name because some of you know Dr. Oz, who has been alleged. I guess they're pointing out in this ad that he experimented on non-human primates and did not do a particularly good job. So I'm not making a political statement here. I'm just asking whether you have seen either good or bad consequences. So good consequences, somebody who supports animal issues, are they able to use that in their campaign to garner votes? Bad consequences, someone who has not supported animal issues, has abused or allegedly abused animals, is that hurting them? I know in the EU, this is a much bigger deal than it seems to be here, but I'd love to get your perspective on this since you're out there on the front lines.
Yeah, I'm going to start in terms of particularly the negative consequences. Absolutely. So I mentioned, you know, we were trying to develop a no-kill shelter. We got that. About 8 years later, we had a different mayor. And then slowly things were kind of changing. We had the same set of volunteers and things there. We started hearing rumors. And in fact, 2 mayors later, the mayor actually talked about a large scale investment to expand the animal shelter, helping to make it even better. At her announcement, she used a rescue dog as part of her campaign kickoff. Meanwhile, from the volunteers, we were hearing a completely different story about the shelter. We were hearing about strange euthanizations happening, that we found the veterinarian that they were using at the site didn't have all the right credentials. Drugs weren't being kept in a proper manner. folks that were volunteering to walk or foster were being retaliated against when they spoke out on anything. In one case, there was a potential euthanization as a retribution act. And so I was an assemblyman at that point. I brought in a number of the volunteers to confidentially meet with me in my office. I then brought it to 3 council members that we had just elected. They decided to make that a part of their main campaign when they sought to take the mayor's spot back. We believe one of the main reasons why we were successful at that time was because of that issue. And in fact, at one point, there was even a prosecution during the campaign by the prosecutor to indict on some of that information. Unfortunately, it was set aside, and folks lost their jobs, but there really was no prosecution to the level we thought that was necessary. But elections matter, as I've said, and again, now they've made the folks that got elected have made a huge number of improvements at the facility. I still don't think it's where it needs to be, but again, we saw that improvement. But I do see on the positive side, like I said, I use the legislation I pass in a lot of my campaign material. And I keep a list of residents that have reached out to me on these issues so that I know I can reach out to them on when things pass. I use them and again, in campaign outreach. When I have groups that I work with, I ask them not to share their lists with me, but could they share messages out on my behalf when we're doing things. We don't really see too much of the, housekeeping seal of approval type things that we see with other groups. And that's where a 501c4 really can make a difference. But yeah, I see it all the time on both. I think we need more of it. And again, I think telling that personal story is so important since the animals can't. It's important for the owners and activists to, if you don't know who your council member, your mayor, but particularly your state legislators are, or what district you're in, it's really important that you know. And they all have, most places it's a part-time job. And so they'll be at community events, whether it's the local fair or whether it's some other charity that you may belong to, they will be showing up to those. It's okay to walk up to them and just introduce yourself and say, hey, I just want to let you know I voted for you or I didn't vote for you. I'd really like to see X or Y. This is really important to me and a lot of my friends. And that does, because believe me, folks on the other side on very certain issues that oppose our bills are constantly in our face. And anytime we lose, and this just happened in New Jersey legislature, we lost a number of Southern New Jersey legislators. And I will tell you, the folks that oppose our legislation said, see, it was because they voted for some of the bills that protect animal rights and animal welfare that they lost. And I don't believe that was the case in particular, but that message does filter into people's minds. So it's important that counter narrative that I think is the truth gets out there too.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. We also, across the nation, geography matters as well. Yeah. I had a really great experience with a Colorado rancher who actually wants to help. He wants to move forward with some pretty progressive animal welfare legislation and to bring communities together instead of being as divided as they are right now. But he had to stop helping us because certain groups went to him and said, we're going to tell your primary opponent that you're actually helping animal rights activists. So he had to stop and disengage, which is really too bad because we were so close to being collaborative and working together for positive solution, and politics just he had to back away. So it's really, animal issues are tough, and I think where you are, especially in a state like Colorado, if you're in Boulder, where I grew up, which is very progressive, you're going to run on animal welfare and say I'm an animal welfare advocate. If you're out east in rural communities, you just can't do it. It's just, you're not going to get the votes. So.
Yeah, I think an interesting thing in the discussion here is that each person brought up essentially an industry that we have in our society, whereby so long as we understand that these industries are going to keep going, we have to have some expected amount of animal death, sickness, and injury. And they were, animal experimentation, ranching, and shelter work. All those industries, as long as we are still under the understanding that those are going to continue, there's going to be some level of animal pain in the world. In Oregon, what we do here is we have a statute that lists out a bunch of these industries, livestock transport, hunting, fishing, trapping, and essentially says that as long as people are behaving not grossly negligently as to those practices, they are not committing animal abuse, animal cruelty, or animal neglect. And so it definitely makes this whole conversation very fraught, that you do have people in the room making the laws and making the decisions who would like to see a complete stop to any animal pain whatsoever. I don't know if David Michelson is over here. There he is supporting an initiative petition here in Oregon that would criminalize any type of animal mistreatment with no exceptions for those kinds of things. And so you have that on one side, and then on the other side, you have people who say, I understand that animals shouldn't be treated cruelly, but I've got this chicken factory to run, and I have to make money on it. So exceptions should be made. It definitely makes it very interesting. One thing that I'll share from my practice is that I have prosecuted cases in the most urban and the most rural communities in the state of Oregon. And I have yet to find a potential juror who doesn't agree with at least the proposition that animals should be treated humanely. And there might be a lot of gray area in there beyond that. But, at least in this Western state, which isn't as, crazy as Portland would make you believe, there is a lot of empathy and a lot of strong feelings that animals should be treated well.
Did you have a question? Sorry, I think, do we have a question online?
Sure.
Okay. we'll
This
come right back to
question
you.
is in respect to the Congressional Animal Protection Caucus. Do they do anything, and are they effective in any way for animal welfare legislation?
So I'm not as familiar with Congress, but I would just suggest whether they are or not isn't as important as the fact, having caucuses. And this is true at state levels, and every state's a little different on how you can have caucuses. Congress, anybody can create a caucus as long as they come together. The fact that someone is self-identified in and of itself is helpful to the extent that we hold them accountable and transparent for their actions. So if they've raised up and said, hey, I want to be a part of something because of, I'm saying I'm one of these folks, they think there's some benefit to them doing that. So it's important we then hold them accountable to say, okay, what's the agenda and what are you doing to advance that? But usually a caucus provides support to each other when you have those loud voices out there. So the fact that a caucus exists generally is a good thing in and of itself. Hopefully you take it further. Now in New Jersey, you can't form a caucus without the approval of the speaker. And so we have very few caucuses in New Jersey. Other states, it's permissive. Whatever the legislature would like to do can. And it is something that I do recommend if you have a pool of legislators that are interested and you're working as a group, trying to form a caucus is helpful because it means each year they will say, these are the couple bills we're trying to get done. And then as a group, they can parlay their joint strength to a speaker or to a Senate president to try to post those bills. And then ultimately, because there's a lot of horse trading that occurs in legislatures. So it's like, there's gonna be a number of tough bills that caucus is gonna be needed to vote on in matters that have nothing to do with animal welfare, or animal rights. So when they now come to say, hey, we need your help to pass this. We know that might be difficult for some of our colleagues, but we're always there for you when we're voting these other tough bills. Why aren't you helping us on ours? And so there's a lot of that you see in legislatures, and in Congress in particular. And so things like a caucus as a mechanism of getting legislators to self-identify and to help push legislation through it can be very helpful.
I think if you're looking for solutions in licensing and interstate commerce, Congress is a really good place to look for that. But if you're talking about criminal animal cruelty, your state legislature is really where you need to be. No offense to Congress, that great august body, but the state legislatures, most crimes are prosecuted on a state or local level. The federal government, in order to prosecute a crime, has to have some kind of nexus with federal concerns like interstate commerce. And there's not really a great nexus between one person in their house beating their dog and interstate commerce. So that's going to be a state level offense. So to the degree that you're focusing your attention on Congress, that's fine for things like the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They can do a lot of regulations there. But if you're talking about individual crimes against individual animals, you should really focus your attention on state legislators.
Yeah, absolutely. We have what's called the Claw Caucus in Colorado, and it's nonpartisan. We have Democrats, Republicans, all showing up and at least having that discussion. So I think what's really beneficial about any caucus is it creates a venue for productive conversations. So whether it's at Congress or at the city level, I always like to see caucuses come together and at least have that dialogue.
Great, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Angie Hernandez. I'm a citizen of the Apache Nation, and I'm here on behalf of Seating Sovereignty. I'm also from the state of California, where I was a former Senate fellow and former legislative staffer. California is one of only a handful of states throughout the country that operates a full-time legislature. The majority of states in the United States operate either on a hybrid or part-time legislature. Do you believe that that impacts those states' ability to pass pro-animal legislation? And if so, what can be done to support other states that more than likely use larger states like California as a ground point to pass their own legislations? Thank you.
So my opinion of this is, so like New Jersey, we're part-time. It's a full-time job. There's just no, I mean, I have another job. I joke I have 2 full-time, part-time jobs. And that's the way my life is, and you just kind of manage it. But we're around the whole year. Some states have a budget year and then they have a policy year. It's just know the process of your particular area and learn how it impacts. So don't try to start a bill if it's 2 weeks before the end of a term. We have a 2-year term. Thankfully, New Jersey, no bill ever dies. So sometimes you'll introduce a bill knowing it's going to get reintroduced and start. So process matters. Know your legislature, know how the process works. Look to see if there are other bills that are similar. I have had animal groups put in competing bills at times, which just is very difficult at that point. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of things, but it doesn't really impact it so much as unless you don't know the process. So full-time doesn't make it necessarily better. We look at, there is about over 6,000 bills that get introduced every year in New Jersey. Only about 100 or 150 get signed into law. So you have to think about that. And how much time will a legislator be able to think about your piece of legislation? Even though legislators may be part-time, or they may be in their term where they're hearing bills may be part-time, most states have full-time staff. And so it's important, like my chief of staff has been very active on these issues and is very helpful to me in tracking all the bills and making sure everything else. Term limits, and I'll turn it over to somebody else to talk about that, can have a huge impact too, because in states that have term limits, they often rely more on lobbyists to be the institutional memory. That's not the case in New Jersey. We're here, like I said, I've been in the legislature for 12 years. We are generally our own institutional memory at that case, or the majority staff, partisan staff will do that job. So the structure does matter, the process does matter, but just it's knowing it that matters. The structure itself doesn't prevent the bills from getting done.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. In Colorado, the legislature starts the second Wednesday in January, but we always kind of say the best bills are passed in August. So you do a lot of lead work to optimally go into session with the deals cut, the votes are counted, the governor's on board, agencies can implement it. So yeah, I actually think having a temporary session adds some urgency to issues and can actually expedite the policy because you only have a few months to work on it. And it can't languish. You either do it in 4 months or you don't do it that year at all. So that's just my perspective.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to say about this, but it always strikes me. We have a citizen legislature here in Oregon as well. It meets for a big session every other year and then a small session in the off years. And it is from what I understand, it is a full-time job. And that strikes me as potentially taking a lot of important voices out of the conversation. A person who's just scraping to get by is not going to run for office because they have to work a full job and do this legislative job. So I am always a little bit skeptical of that part-time legislature system, but I understand it's pretty popular in most states.
Yeah, and just to follow up, one of the issues with term limits, to your point, is by the time you're able or qualified to be in leadership, you probably only have one term left or a couple of years left. So there are benefits and sort of downfalls to term limits. And one of them is being sort of that institutional knowledge that the Assemblyman kind of pointed to. But yeah, it's always dynamic. So.
Wonderful, thank you. I just would add, there are some states that meet every other year as well. And so to the question, I think that can sometimes stall legislation, but it also leads to the urgency of getting bills done every couple of years. So definitely.
And never forget, I serve on the budget committee as well. Never forget the budget process. The budget process, it's one bill, but it is the most important bill on a lot of things, whether you fund your prosecutors to make sure that they have the ability to prosecute these types of crimes, whether you're funding shelters. New York provides funding to each of the counties for their shelters. New Jersey does not. We have counties with no shelter because there is no funding for that. So budgets are moral documents, and oftentimes groups forget to lobby for their issues during the budget process, instead focusing on actual different pieces of legislation. And so never forget, funding drives a lot of the policy. And so, the budget process, if it's maybe there's a year in a state legislature where all they're doing is a budget, don't forget, you don't go home during that year too. You got to be there lobbying for those issues as well in funding.
Great point.
Hi, my name is Samita Jonak, and my question is about the state of Texas. So Texas Biomed in my hometown received ARPA funding, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. And it created a lot of protests within the city. A lot of the citizens came out and vocalized their discontent with that allocation of resources to this private entity, especially since Texas Biomed is very heavily funded through their own private club, and they also receive NIH funding. So in that situation, when I know my councilman and I know my mayor is getting funding from Texas Biomed as, for elections, how can we as citizens effectively get our voices heard when going against a large institution like Texas Biomed?
So I was going to say this at the beginning and I didn't. It's a great place towards the end to say this. You got to run for office. You got to work on campaigns. I encourage you to work on a campaign before you try running for office. We'd get much better office holders if they did that. I managed campaigns. I was a campaign volunteer for many years before I ran, even though I was only 25 when I ran. I had done it for 5 years prior to that. And a lot of first-time candidates have never worked on a campaign. A lot of policy also gets done when you're working on a campaign. You often get time with elected officials that you otherwise would not, but for working on a campaign. So it is another way groups can really get the ear of staff, because staff sometimes will take time off to go work the campaign as the manager or as a field director or something like that. Same thing. So look at campaigns as a way to get to know the candidates, but also to get your issues in front of them. But second, you got to run for office yourself at some point. It's even when you lose a race, if you can show sufficient number of the residents support your issue, the folks you run against generally, if they're smart, will co-opt those issues. They might only meet you halfway, but they want to be able to say they did something about it so that you don't run again the next time, or they don't have opposition from that issue next time. So I've run races where I've lost. I've run, of course, plenty where I've won, but I've almost every single time I've run and lost, I saw the folks take notice and try to co-opt the issues that I ran on. So, don't just assume because you're in an area, particularly for animal welfare and animal rights, it generally is very bipartisan in many areas. So it doesn't matter what your political affiliation is, run. And I can't emphasize that enough.
Okay, we've got an online question.
This is from a guest in Minnesota, where the agriculture industry and hunting and game are very powerful and have lots of money and lobbyists in St. Paul. Both resist any legislation that would better protect animals. Do you have any strategic advice on how to deal with such strong and deeply entrenched opposition?
I can take this one because we've been dealing with this quite a bit. Like you said, ag is incredibly well-funded, incredibly powerful. One of the big issues that kind of keeps tripping us up is Democrats who are in control of both chambers and the governor's office are really focused on low-income communities right now and getting protein to those low-income communities. And if we put more restrictions, or at least being told if we put more restrictions on how ag treats their animals, the price of that protein is going to go up. And then they're going to look like they're not sympathetic to their low-income communities. So I'm more addressing a problem than I am a strategy. But I think what we're finding is working is persistence, and showing ag that you're not going to go away and that these issues are going to keep coming up and coming up. And at some point, the public will also basically show that support and start forcing groups like ag to come to the table and negotiate in good faith. Because right now, honestly, they don't have to. They get the votes and they can kill pretty much whatever they want as far as legislation is concerned. So I know it's a pretty simple answer, but not going away, making sure they know that you're going to stay and keep fighting for the rights of animals.
And the other way we do it, and it hasn't been successful yet, but I think it's shown some success, is where we look for inequities between different types of animals. So for example, when we're working to kind of fight folks that are abusers that are using animals to maintain their abusive relationships with a spouse or a partner, when you break it to that level and say, well, if they're abusing a dog or a cat, they're not allowed to. But if it's a horse, because horses are treated as livestock under New Jersey law, they should be allowed to. That makes no sense to most folks. And so as we're trying to pass laws to make sure that there's equity among all animals for this, it starts breaking down some of those barriers and getting folks to kind of understand that animals are animals. And there are inequities in our protections to animals in statute. And so you have to find another issue that everybody agrees on that shows that that breaks down that inequity, and then you can kind of take it from there.
Yeah, that absolutely. In Colorado, we're working on a post-conviction mental health issue where they are covered in companion animal areas, but not in livestock. So it's a really good example of that inequity within statute.
One thing that occurs to me that would be pretty effective in this regard are examples of things that have actually happened, to where, you can't, the agricultural community, which is very strong here in Oregon as well, can't come back and say, well, we want that to keep happening. So if you have an example of something egregious, if you have an example of something so facially inhumane that even the people that are on the agricultural side aren't going to want to defend that kind of behavior, that kind of outcome. That's, you know, your best bet scenario to try to change minds and hearts about that.
And it also depends on your state structure with the initiative process. You may just get to a point where you've hit every wall. There's no more path because the group, whoever it is just, but they're never going to lose. So if you get that public will behind you and you have enough funding to run an initiative on the ballot, that's sort of the nuclear option. But at the same time, it may be the only option.
Yeah, and animal groups have a good track record of passing initiatives because
Do.
public's often on our side. Ari?
Hi, I'm wondering when you're considering a new law, does it affect you at all to have one group maybe threaten to file a lawsuit against that law if it passes? And then the flip side of it is, does it assuage any of those concerns to have a different group offer to defend the law from those kinds of attacks?
So I'll defer a little bit in terms of to see what your experience has been. Legally dubious laws still sometimes pass. But I will say if we have an opinion from our nonpartisan Office of Legislative Services or from a respected legal group outside, and they say, hey, we're going to challenge this anyway. Sometimes that backfires. I mean, usually that does make a legislator pause. And they will look again to say, well, is there some way to make it legally protected? Sometimes, though, that does backfire and they say, okay, we'll let the judges figure it out then. We're just going to pass it. And that does happen. So particularly with around gun legislation right now, that we don't know what's, because it's literally changing by the moment and by the whims of judges right now. And so, like I said, sometimes you just get fed up and you're like, well, that's going to be a court to decide. In the meantime, I still want to do this. So there's a little bit of a balance. If there's something that's very particular, we're going to want to try to fix that. But if it's just a, hey, I'm going to sue you no matter what, that usually backfires.
I'm a real rule of law guy, so I don't like when legislators or people proposing initiatives like sort of boldly go forward with something that's obviously going to get struck down by the courts. But I think I agree, you know, if you have a reasonable basis to believe that your legislation is going to be upheld, then there's no reason not to push forward as strongly as you can.
Yeah, and to have case law back me up as I'm lobbying is super helpful. So,
and sometimes legislation is being used as a novel way to be challenged to change law too, as a basis for changing law. That's rare, but we still do that once in a while.
Okay, we have time for probably one more question if there are any others.
Over there.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Thank you.
Please look this way.
Maybe two questions. We'll see.
Hi, good morning. I appreciate you guys all being here. My name is Saba. I'm a first-year law student, and I worked on political campaigns in Iowa and Washington. And I strongly believe that a society's advancement is dependent on how they treat women, people with disabilities, and animals. And I know you guys are doing a lot of work, but I would just love to hear more on how each of you, through your words and actions, are attempting to unite people on both sides and people in the middle to see animal welfare as a common problem.
I think it goes right back to the legislation I was talking about a little bit earlier. We've seen now that there's broad connections to those that abuse power, not only abuse folks of another gender, folks with a different sexuality or other protected class, as well as animals. The only problem is animals continue to be an area where it's sometimes more acceptable for harm, at least under the law. Thankfully, I think societal mores have changed to make that unacceptable too, but the laws have not caught up to what folks believe. But I still think there are plenty of groups out there that are marginalized where it's perfectly acceptable to have either even outward hatred to, and we let that happen. And so I think anytime we move our society to a more just society in any of those areas, it's going to help animal rights and animal welfare in general too. because a more compassionate society is going to be more compassionate to animals in general. And so that's why equity oftentimes is at the core of what I do across a lot of different categories. I'm chair of transportation. And so, you know, we look to a lot of our work here to make sure that we create a transportation system that's good for everyone. And it does, it thankfully has lots of crossovers into a lot of different areas. So yeah, I think when we make compassion and equity the center stage of all that we do, it makes it a lot easier for us to have the conversations we need to advance animal rights and welfare.
Yeah, I agree as well. And how someone treats animals is pretty indicative of how they treat people as well. So it is that holistic sort of approach that we need to be looking at, and really not just taking care of each other, but taking care of animals, people that can't take care of themselves, and really being compassionate. So, yeah.
Yeah, I deal with this on a bit more of a micro level. So like when I'm thinking about the ways to deal with criminal prosecutions, I try to take into account everything that the defense attorney tells me about their client. So is this a person who's going to have immigration consequences if they get a certain kind of conviction? Is this a person who never got proper care growing up, had substance abuse issues, have mental health issues? I'm going to take all that into account in trying to resolve the case in a fair and just manner, because I understand that these are people in our society. You know, a lot of people, when they hear what I do for a living, they want me to throw the book at every single defendant. But that's just not realistic. That's not how our system is designed, maybe in Texas. But here, it's not how our system is designed, and it's not realistic to think that's how it's going to work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Okay.
Hi, my name is Piper. I'm a 2L student at University of San Francisco. Thank you so much for being here. My question is about student advocates, animal advocates engaging with the political process, and what advice you would have for that when it seems very intimidating and often hostile to animal advocates. Thank you.
So this one's really tough. Activism at the university itself. So, you know, I have a lot of folks, I started out young, so we have a very strong intern program where we take folks from college, and I do a lot of mentoring of high school and college students. And many of them are never going to go into politics. Some are science, because I have a science background. I often attract folks that have a science background as well, that just want to kind of see what it's like in government and want a better understanding. And I've had folks that have worked on my campaigns, that have worked on, disinvestment of fossil fuels at universities, better hiring practices, everything else. And universities are some of the hardest. And it's funny because oftentimes universities are painted as being very far left institutions and progressive, and they are oftentimes because of their faculty and students, but they are power structures like anything else. And they are designed to be able to kind of dictate their own world, even more so than public education at a high school, or where there are long court cases of showing what rights there are. Although we're in a kind of a time of flux there too. Universities are very hard. And so I'm not the one to say what's best, but you can take a lot of those models, whether it's for civil rights, whether it's on disinvestment on fossil fuels, on some of these other successful movements at university levels, and kind of take those on, particularly in animal experimentation. A lot of universities have made changes because of those students that are working in the sciences just saying, no, there's a better way to do this, and saying it's not essential. And there's been a lot of pushback there. But I've seen some movement in some universities where they've changed their process. The Dr. Oz case brought to light, a situation where there was a lot of violations and he was banned from doing research for a while. Making sure that those types of things are enforced teaching students that they can speak up when they see violations and reporting those violations and making sure that there are anti-whistleblower laws around those types of things. These are all things that students can actively do on their campuses to ask that boards of trustees pass those rules.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I always kind of go back to the 80-20 rule. We have more in common than we ever really tell each other. So I think if you can start with points of commonality and kind of go from there and understand the other side and what they're saying and sort of how they're approaching it, they're going to be able to do that with you too. So that's,
No idea.
And that's fair. We could have probably learned from the earlier panel this morning too about the future of animal education. I bet they'd have some interesting thoughts on that. I want to thank our panelists so much for the conversation this morning and all we've learned and for traveling all this way to impart your wisdom. And thank you all so much for joining us in this session.